Hey guys, welcome. Good to see you. All righty, we are in Revolutionary War Part 1. We have been talking about the events to the Revolutionary War, but today we're going to be talking about the shots that have been fired. It's on. All righty, first off, as we go into the war, we're going to see two sides to the war. We're going to see the British on one side and the colonists, rebels, patriots on the other. You're going to hear a lot of different names for both sides. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up my notes and divide a page in half. Let me show you that. So when last we met, we had talked about the intolerable acts after the Boston Tea Party. We had talked about the First Continental Congress. They have sent folks home to train militia, Minutemen, and Patrick Henry at that said, I am no longer a Virginian, I am an American. And so I divided my paper in half after that. If you don't have this much space, then you may want to flip the page. And I apologize that it's already written today. You don't get to write it with me, but I'd already recorded this once and it didn't work. So we're going to try again. All right, I'm going to zoom in on the British side first. Okay, and I'm going to show you some pictures. So, of course, Great Britain, England, the king, the person who's been taxing everybody already. Groups of folks in the colonies, the actual colonists themselves, that wanted to remain loyal to the king were called loyalists. And if you think about it, the colonies are actually a part of England at this time. And so people are like, that's our king. This is our country. We should be loyal to our country and our king. And some of the loyalists also wanted to stay loyal because they were like, how on earth could we ever go up against the British Army? They're the baddest mamma jammas in the world right now. They've beaten the French all over the world. They have battleships. They have trained soldiers. They have uniforms. We ain't got nothing. We better be loyal because we don't stand a chance against them. So loyalists is what those colonists were called. Tories is also another name for the colonists that supported the king and staying a part of England. So those two, you'll hear loyalists and Tories. When you get into the actual army, the British Army, they have these two names, the regulars and the redcoats because of the red coats that they wear. And then the colonists or the soldiers on the colonist side, as an insult, would call them lobsterbacks. They would taunt them. Hey, lobsterback. That was a way of making fun of them. Lobsterbacks. And then I skipped a space because these folks down here are not British. They are Germans. The British, because they got all the money from all the taxes and they actually have an army, they hire German soldiers to fight for them as well, to come and join them and fight for them. And they are called Hessians. And Hessians at this time around the world had a reputation. They, from childhood, were raised up to be soldiers, killing machines. And so when patriots or colonists saw the German Hessians in their green uniforms, it struck terror in their hearts that they had been hired to fight alongside the British. We also have different Native American groups that join the British side and different Native American groups that join the colonist side. Okay, but these are some of the names that you might hear when we talk about the British. I'm going to pull up pictures of these so you can see the British side. And I started with the British side because right now the colonies are British. It's actually the other side that are the rebels, the upstarts, the people going against the grain. All right, so on our Padlet on Tuesday, you can see a sketch of what a British soldier would have looked like. You can see why I draw the silly looking hat on all my stick figures. Now this would be their formal uniform. When they were fighting, they often did not wear all of these pieces, especially the hat. You can see they have a long rifle there, okay? And we'll compare that kind of that size. If you think about if that was down on the ground, and maybe would come up to, you know, about his midsection. And because we'll look at some pictures later on of other weapons. All right, so this would be a red coat, a lobster back, or a regular. If we come down here, you see a political cartoon from the time, and you can see colonial children, and it looks like even the adults are looking on and kind of snickering, kind of laughing. And we have a colonist there, and on the back of his shirt, it says they've stuck a piece of paper on it that says Tory. They're labeling him as a supporter of the British. And this actually causes some more attention. Not only do we have soldiers walking the streets, but we also don't know really, you know, our friends and neighbors who they support. So if you were a rebel, a patriot, you might be scared to say something, because if your neighbor is a loyalist or a Tory, they might report you to the soldiers and the British officials. And if you're a loyalist, you might be scared to say something, because the patriots might tell the Sons of Liberty that you're a loyalist, and then, you know, you're getting harassed and threatened in the streets. So both sides were causing tension with one another. And here is a picture of the German Hessians and what their uniforms would have looked like. In a book that you may know, I Survived the Revolutionary War, they talk about a sea of green coming over the hill as the Hessians attacked. So just a neat visual. Then we're going to get into the Continental Army and the other side. So let me pull up the notes for that again. All right, so I'm going to scoot these over a little bit. So on the other side, we have the colonists. The colonists call themselves patriots, meaning that they fight for freedom. They are also the rebels. They're the ones going against the grain. When we talk about the colonists and not the soldiers, opposite of Tories, they would be known as Whigs. When we come down into fighting groups, we talked about with the First Continental Congress, they went home and formed militias, which are small military units, okay? Men in the militias were known as Minutemen because they weren't trained soldiers like over here in the British. They were the dads, the brothers, the uncles. They were the farmers, the cabinet makers, you know, the guy who was the butcher, the guy who made the candlesticks. They weren't paid to be soldiers. They were just defending their homes from the British soldiers that were threatening them. And so they would be asleep at home in their own beds, and they'd have to get up and be ready in a minute's notice. Something fun to kind of do is, you know, have a family member or a friend set a timer for a minute, and then lay out beside your bed, you know, your clothes and, you know, maybe a broom handle to pretend like it's your gun, and maybe a bag to throw over your shoulder that would be your ammunition, and see if you could get out of bed and put all that stuff together and be ready to go and fight in a minute. After this week, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Congress is going to meet again. It's going to be the Second Continental Congress, and they're going to decide it's time for us to actually start hiring people to leave their homes and be soldiers. And they formed the Continental Army. So now we're actually going to have an army start after the Battle of Bunker Hill. We're going to form an army, and we're going to have George Washington as its leader. So the Continental Army, and they were also known as the Continentals. Over here, we had insults, the lobsterbacks. Well, the British, not to be outdone, had an insult for the colonist soldiers. They called them Yankees. And they made up an insulting song called Yankee Doodle. And so they sometimes called them Yankee Doodles. And if you listen to the words in Yankee Doodle, they're meant to make fun of the colonist soldiers. But it kind of backfired on the British because the colonist soldiers were like, whatever, I'll own it. I am a Yankee. I am a Yankee Doodle. I love this tune. And they started singing it and owning it and making it their own, which is kind of cool. Kind of a life lesson there, you know, if somebody's going to make fun of you for something, be like, yeah, I got red hair. What of it? Okay. So the song Yankee Doodle is also there on our Padlet if you would like to listen to it as well. So Yankees and Yankee Doodles. And then I skipped a space. We are still on the side of the colonists, but I put TN for Tennessee. I always try and bring it back home where we are living, and we live in Tennessee. And Tennessee was not a colony. It wasn't even a state. It was a territory that people lived in, mostly hunters and farmers and people who were spread out and pioneers. But right next to Tennessee, over the Appalachian Mountains, is North Carolina. And when battles started happening in North Carolina, the word made it across the Appalachian Mountains to the Tennesseans, and Tennesseans volunteered to go and fight in North Carolina. So they went over the Appalachian Mountains and went and fought at Kings Mountain in North Carolina. So they became known as the Over Mountain Men. So here we have some more Tennessee history of where we have volunteered when our brothers and sisters have needed us. We have picked up our weapons and gone, and we are known as the volunteer state. We actually did not get this name because of this event. That's actually a battle that happens much later on, the Battle of the Alamo in Texas, which has nothing to do with this war. But Tennessee is always ready to volunteer to go and help out those in need. And that's why we're the volunteer state. Here is a picture of what a gentleman in the Continental Army might look like. Now, of course, these are all sketches of what their uniforms would look like because we did not have, cell phones and cameras where we could take a lot of pictures at the time. So most of this come from sketches. Okay. So you can see his weapons and things there. So we were blue coats at that point in time, but they didn't really, that name didn't catch on. The militia or Minutemen would have just been wearing their normal everyday clothes, what they would wear around the village. So their clothes are not, red or blue, and they don't have the big shiny buttons on them. But this kind of worked to their advantage because in the browns and greens and beiges that they owned, they would have blended into the trees, and they could duck behind trees and rocks. So it was kind of like the beginnings of camouflage. Whereas the British soldiers marching in a straight line, all wearing bright red, they stuck out like a sore thumb. They were easy pickings at that point in time, which works to the colonists' advantage. And then here, this is a picture of two men that are reenacting. So this is a modern picture of two men that dressed up like Tennessee Over Mountain Men. And you'll notice that they're dressed in their normal hunting clothes that they would wear to go hunting in. The men living in Tennessee at the time would have used long rifles, and they would have been used to hunting things like squirrel and rabbits and deer, fast-moving prey. So at the Battle of Kings Mountain, it's these over the mountain men that make a huge difference because their rifles with that length on them make it more accurate. And they're used to hunting tiny squirrels and rabbits that run really fast. So the British officers marching along in red were easy pickings for these over the mountain men. So they made a huge difference there in that battle that we'll talk about much later in the war. Okay, so both sides of the battle. Okay, and then we're ready to start the war. Bum, 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 bum. Okay, guys. There is a song here, The Shot Heard Round the World, and we're going to look at this article, The Road to Freedom. There is also a video here, and I've got a disclaimer there, so I just want to talk to you about it for a minute before you go and watch videos during this time. We are talking about war, and in war, folks are using weapons and hurting each other. As a teacher, I do not share these videos with you because I want you to go out and hurt each other, nor do I want you to play with weapons or guns at all. You should never play with weapons or guns, children. We want you to be safe and happy and healthy, but I also want you to understand what this might have looked like from our history. So a lot of the videos in the next coming weeks are going to show gunfire and cannons as a historical event. But I want you to be a little mature about it. Okay? I don't want you to be like, oh! I want you to be a little mature about it. So when you watch these videos, I want you to realize that these are reenactments of what it might have been like to be there, what it might have been like to live through this history. So we show these videos and the clips to help you understand better what we're reading and talking about. All right, here is the article. The Road to Freedom. Minutemen were volunteer soldiers who were ready in a minute to fight the British. It was the night of April 18th, 1775. In Boston, lanterns in a church steeple revealed that the British redcoats were on the move. They wanted to capture the colonists' hidden weapons. Paul Revere and 2 others rode out to warn the people. So we have a whole regiment of British soldiers that are marching, and they have been tipped off by a loyalist or a Tory that the colonists are hiding weapons. And the soldiers and the king are like, no, the colonists are not allowed to hide weapons like they're going to fight us. No, we're just going to march and we're going to get those weapons. So this is how it starts. The British start marching to go get those hidden weapons. And Paul Revere and a few others get on their horses and they go from town to town and tell the people, wake up, get ready, they're coming. The British are coming, okay? Or the regulars are coming. The Redcoats marched all night. They arrived in Lexington near dawn. The Minutemen were waiting. No one knows which side fired first, but the battle began. That first shot became known as the shot heard round the world. Now, do you really think folks over in France and Australia and Spain could hear the gunshot in Lexington, Massachusetts? No. The reason it was the shot heard round the world is because the newspapers wrote about what happened in Lexington and Concord that night. And the people all around the world were like, what? The British Army is like the baddest mamma jamma in the world. That's like the biggest bully on the playground, the biggest 5th grader on the playground. Okay? And the colonists don't even have an army. That's like the little kindergartner walking up to the biggest bully and punching him right in the nose. The whole world was like, what are they doing? What's going to happen? if television had been around at that time, everybody would have been turning on their TV and every channel would have been airing this news. It was epic. So when we say it was the shot heard around the world, we're not actually talking about hearing the gunshot. We're talking about the news was huge. Okay? I'm going to show you a picture before we read that last paragraph. I want you to see this picture of Lexington from George versus George. So we have a group of colonial Minutemen, about 60 colonial Minutemen, and we have a whole regiment of British soldiers, about 900 British soldiers, if I'm not mistaken. And at Lexington, these Minutemen, these 60 guys, are standing there in a field facing off against trained British soldiers. Imagine if you were one of those Minutemen. You're a farmer. You've been woken up in the middle of the night by someone coming and saying, the British soldiers are coming. We have to stop them. And what the men at Lexington were doing is they were trying to stall them from getting to Concord and finding the weapons. Because if the British soldiers got to Concord and found the weapons, not only would they get all the weapons and all the work that the colonists have been putting in to get those weapons, but they also would have arrested and probably hung a lot of people as traitors because of the weapons they had. So the men that are standing there in that field know they really don't stand a chance against that many British soldiers. But they stand there to give everyone in the town time. How brave is that? How scary would that be? And how brave would you have to be to stand there, to put up any kind of a fight against those odds? It's pretty epic. All right, going back to the article, last paragraph. So after the battle on the Green in Lexington, the British marched on to Concord. Few of the well-hidden weapons were found because the word had gotten there and they had already hidden them. They had moved them someplace else again. By the time the British turned back, though, the colonists were angry. They hid along the road, crouching behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. As the British soldiers approached, the easy-to-see redcoats were attacked. By the time the British made it back to Boston, 247 redcoats had been killed or wounded, and the Revolutionary War had begun. So at Lexington, we have 10 on the colonist side that are killed, that lose their lives. But on the British side, by the end of this, we have 247. That was a third of their original troop, just about. In this picture of Concord, some of the help came from this bridge here. This is a strategy that the colonists used. So while the soldiers in Lexington are holding back the British as best they can, Paul Revere and his friends are all out saying, the British are coming, come on, come on, come on, come on. So by the time the British soldiers make it to Concord, there are now thousands of colonists there, okay? And they're on one side of the bridge and the British are on the other. In order for the British to get across the bridge, they have to come across in groups of like 4 or 5. So instead of the colonists facing off against a whole big old line of British soldiers, they're facing off against 4 or 5 at a time. So that was a strategy that helped the colonists be successful here at Concord. And there are some quotes on this page. Major Buttrick says, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire." So he's encouraging the colonists. That's a quote from him at the time. Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the founders of the Sons of Liberty, he said, "These fellows say we won't fight. By heavens, I hope I shall die up to my knees in blood." So he's saying, if I'm going to die against all these soldiers, I hope I take some out with me. And then George Washington was heard to say, "A brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's breast." Because remember, the British and the colonists are the same when this starts. The colonists are British citizens. So he's saying a brother has stabbed another brother. The once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or inhabited by slaves. So we either fight or we lose all of our freedoms. All right, guys, so here is the note on the revolution beginning. So I put a big banner because we are no longer in the events that caused the war. We are at war. The shots have been fired. All right, in April 1775, the Revolutionary War begins. Shots are fired at Lexington and Concord, Emmaus, Massachusetts. And then I drew my little British soldiers and my little colonists. I did go ahead and put them in blue, even though we're technically not an army yet. And I have them firing back and forth at each other. Okay. Included in that, and the last thing that we'll read is the article about Paul Revere. So we have to include that because this happens that night, Paul Revere's famous midnight ride. The reason it was made famous is many, many years later, a poet wrote a poem about Paul Revere. And I know we've been studying a lot of poetry with Love That Dog, so you may want to look at that poem. And so he wrote about Paul Revere. So a lot of the other names of the folks that did the same thing Paul Revere did got lost because nobody wrote a famous poem about them. One of them was actually a young lady. When the British landed near New York, she rode in New York, if I'm not mistaken, and her name was Sybil Ludington. So if you want to know about that, girls, look up Sybil Ludington and see if you can find out about her, because Paul Revere was a grown man riding through the night, but this young lady, she did it too. Okay, and I put in quotes, "The British are coming." We don't really know exactly what he said, what he yelled as he was riding. I believe in Liberty's Kids, they have him yelling, "The regulars are coming." But he gave warning by hanging lanterns in the church steeple and then riding out. He gave warning so those folks could wake up and not be surprised by soldiers in their town while they were still in their PJs. Okay. All right, I'll pull this back up at the end, but I'm going to go ahead. If you need to pause, you can write that down. I'm going to look at the article about Paul Revere. Midnight Ride. Paul Revere risked his own freedom to warn the patriots. Would you take a risk to warn others of danger? Paul Revere did. He knew he could be arrested, yet he wanted America to be free from the British. When Paul found out British troops were moving, he had lanterns hung in a church steeple. They were a signal for the patriots in case he didn't complete his ride. Then he rode to Lexington. Paul warned the patriots that the British were coming. Before he reached the next town, British soldiers caught Paul. They questioned him and let him go, but they took his horse. After his ride, Paul carried more messages for the patriots. He became a soldier. He even printed paper money for the patriots. Each act was dangerous, but Paul had the courage to stand up for his beliefs. And on our Padlet, there's also a funny commercial that supposes that if Paul Revere actually had a cell phone, he wouldn't have had to take that midnight ride. All right, guys. So today we learned different names for both sides of the war, and we learned about the Revolutionary War beginning. Shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, and they are combined together because that all happened within the same night. Lexington started about dawn, and then by about mid-morning, they were already in Concord. And Paul Revere rode through the night before they made it there to warn everyone about them coming. All right, guys, I'll see you next time, and we'll talk about another battle in the war.